The look on Magistrate Corvin's face told Henrik Finch everything he needed to know about what would happen if he defied the law today. But Henrik's hand remained steady as he reached for the quill. Beyond the tall leaded windows of the magistrate's chambers, the spring afternoon cast golden light across the valley Henrik had called home for 26 years. And in that light stood Grasha, her green skin gleaming like polished jade, her dark eyes watching him through the glass with an expression caught somewhere between hope and resignation. "You understand," Corvin said, his voice dropping to something almost paternal, almost kind, "that I must record your refusal to comply. The Crown's decree is explicit. No human shall enter into matrimonial contract with any creature of orc blood. The penalty is forfeiture of land, title, and citizenship. You will be cast out, Henrik. Your father's farm, the acres he broke his back cultivating, will revert to the Crown. You will have nothing." Henrik dipped the quill in the inkwell. The scratch of the nib against parchment seemed impossibly loud in the silent chamber. He wrote his full name in the careful script his mother had taught him before fever took her when he was 8. Henrik James Finch. Below that, he wrote the date. Below that, in letters that seemed to burn themselves into the page, he wrote the words that would change everything. "I hereby acknowledge my intent to marry Grasha, daughter of Clan Ironhide, and accept all legal consequences thereof." Corvin made a sound like a man watching someone walk deliberately into a fire. "Think of your legacy, boy. Your grandfather cleared that land when it was nothing but forest and stone. Your father fought in 3 border wars to keep it safe. And you would throw it all away for—" He stopped himself, but Henrik heard the unspoken word hanging in the air. "For her, for a monster, for an orc." Henrik set down the quill and met the magistrate's gaze. "My father taught me that a man's word is his bond. I gave Grasha my word. The farm is just land. She is my future." He signed the paper, pressed his thumb into the wax seal, and walked out of the magistrate's chambers into the afternoon sun. Grasha stood exactly where he had left her, near the stone wall that bordered the town square, far enough away that her presence would not cause alarm, but close enough that she could watch the proceedings through the window. She wore the doeskin dress she had sewn herself, the one that showed the powerful lines of her shoulders and the lean strength of her arms. Her black hair, which she usually kept in a practical braid, hung loose around her face, softening the angular planes of her features. Her tusks, small and curved like ivory crescent moons, showed as her lips parted in surprise when he took her hand. "You did it," she said, not a question, a statement of wonder. "I told you I would." Her fingers, calloused from years of hunting and surviving in the wilderness, tightened around his. "They will come for the farm. Tomorrow, probably. We should pack tonight." They walked through the town together, and Henrik felt the weight of every stare, every whispered curse, every mother pulling her child closer as they passed. Old Marcus, who had taught Henrik to shoe horses, turned his back and spat into the dirt. Widow Brennan, who Henrik had helped through 2 hard winters, crossed herself and hurried into her cottage. By the time they reached the edge of town, Henrik's jaw ached from clenching it, but he kept his expression calm, kept his stride steady. Grasha needed to see that he was certain, that he had no regrets. The farm sat in a gentle valley 2 miles from town, a patchwork of tilled fields and pastures bordered by a line of ancient oaks that marked where civilization ended and the wild forest began. Henrik's father had built the house with his own hands, a sturdy structure of fieldstone and timber that had weathered 30 years of mountain weather. The barn stood behind it, gray wood silvered by sun and rain, and beyond that the chicken coop, the smokehouse, the well with its pitched roof. Everything Henrik had ever known, everything he was about to lose, Grasha had been living in the barn for 3 months, ever since the night she stumbled onto his property with an arrow in her shoulder and blood soaking through the rough leather of her traveling cloak. Henrik had heard the noise, investigated with his hunting bow drawn, and found her collapsed against the barn door, her green skin pale with blood loss, her eyes glazed with pain but still defiant. He should have turned her away. Any reasonable man would have. The border wars between humans and orc clans had cooled in recent years, but the hatred still burned hot. Orcs killed humans. Humans killed orcs. That was simply how the world worked. But when Henrik looked at her that night, bleeding and alone and still too proud to beg for help, he had seen something that stopped him cold. He had seen himself 3 years ago, standing beside his father's grave, alone and exhausted and wondering if he had the strength to keep going. So he had helped her into the barn, fetched his sewing kit and his strongest whiskey, and pulled the arrow out by lamplight while she bit down on a leather strap and made no sound at all. He had stitched the wound closed with the same careful precision he used on torn sails and split grain sacks, had wrapped it in clean linen, and had told her she could stay until she healed. She had stayed. The wound healed, but she stayed. And somewhere between teaching her to milk the goats and learning from her how to read the forest signs that predicted weather, somewhere between shared meals and shared silences, Henrik had realized that he did not want her to leave. That when she looked at him with those dark eyes, he felt something he had not felt since before his father died. He felt less alone. Now, as they walked up the dirt path to the farmhouse, Grasha said quietly, "You should have let me leave, I know. You could have kept everything, your home, your place in the town, I know." "Why, Henrik?" She stopped walking, pulled him around to face her. The setting sun cast her face in shadow and light, making the green of her skin glow like summer leaves. "Why would you do this? I am nothing to you, just an orc who stayed too long." Henrik took both her hands in his. Her hands were bigger than his, her fingers longer, her grip stronger. He loved that about her. He loved everything about her, and the realization had been creeping up on him for weeks, but this was the first time he allowed himself to say it aloud. "You are everything to me, and I would rather have a life with you and nothing else than have everything else without you." Her eyes went wide, and for a moment she looked impossibly young, impossibly vulnerable. Then she pulled him close and pressed her forehead to his. A gesture he had learned was how orcs showed affection, how they communicated trust and intimacy. Her breath was warm against his face, and when she spoke, her voice was rough with emotion. "My people would kill me if they knew I loved a human. Your people will cast you out for loving me. We will have nothing, Henrik, no clan, no home, no place in this world. Then we will make our own place." He pulled back enough to meet her eyes. "Grasha, I am asking you to marry me. Not because the law says we cannot, but because I want to spend my life with you. Will you?" She kissed him then, and her tusks pressed gently against his cheeks, and her lips were soft and warm and tasted like the honey tea she had been drinking that afternoon. When they broke apart, she was smiling, really smiling, the kind of smile that made his heart feel too big for his chest. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you, Henrik Finch." They spent that evening packing what they could carry. Henrik had a wagon and 2 horses, old but sturdy, that had belonged to his father. They loaded it with tools, seeds, preserved food, blankets, clothes, his father's books, his mother's wedding ring which he had been saving without quite knowing why, and everything else that could be useful in starting over. Grasha packed her hunting bow, her knives, her few possessions, and the doeskin dress she had worn to the magistrate's office, folding it carefully and placing it at the bottom of her pack like a treasure. They worked in silence mostly. the weight of what they were leaving behind pressing down on both of them. Henrik walked through the house one last time, touching the doorframe his father had carved with their family initials, running his hand along the mantel above the fireplace, where his mother used to keep her collection of smooth river stones. This house held every memory of his childhood, every ghost of the people who had made him who he was. Leaving it felt like cutting off a piece of himself. But when he stepped outside and saw Grasha securing the last of their supplies to the wagon, her movements efficient and strong, her presence solid and real in the gathering darkness, he knew he was making the right choice. Love was not something you found often in this world. When you found it, you held on to it, no matter the cost. They slept in the barn that night, wrapped in each other's arms on a pile of straw and blankets. Grasha's body was warm against his, her heart beat steady beneath his palm, and Henrik allowed himself to feel afraid. Tomorrow they would leave. Tomorrow they would have nothing but each other and a wagon full of supplies and the vast unknown stretching out before them. He was terrified, but he was also, strangely, excited. For the first time in 3 years, since his father's death, he felt like he was moving towards something instead of just enduring. At dawn, they hitched the horses and climbed onto the wagon seat. Henrik took the reins, Grasha sat beside him, and they started down the road that led away from the farm, away from the town, away from everything Henrik had ever known. They were half a mile down the road when Henrik heard the sound of hoofbeats behind them. He turned to see a group of riders cresting the hill, at least 8 men on horseback, and he recognized the lead rider immediately. Deputy Ferris, a hard man with a cruel streak, who had never made a secret of his hatred for orcs. The men with him were townspeople, farmers and tradesmen Henrik had known his whole life, but their faces were set in expressions of cold determination. "Keep driving," Henrik told Grasha quietly. She did not argue, just flicked the reins to urge the horses a little faster. The riders caught up easily. They surrounded the wagon, forcing Henrik to pull the horses to a stop. Deputy Ferris guided his horse right up to the wagon seat, close enough that Henrik could smell the tobacco on his breath. "Heard you signed the papers yesterday, Finch. Heard you are leaving." "That is right. Magistrate wanted to make sure you understood the terms. You are no longer a citizen. You have no rights under Crown law. That means if something were to happen to you out there in the wild, well, there would be no investigation, no justice. You understand?" Henrik's hands tightened on the reins. "I understand." Ferris's gaze slid to Grasha and his lip curled. "You know, if you came to your senses, left the orc here, you could come back. Magistrate said he would be willing to overlook the whole thing. You could keep the farm, keep your place in town." "No, you are a fool, Finch, maybe, but I am a fool who keeps his word." One of the other riders, a young man named Thomas who Henrik had once called a friend, spat onto the ground near the wagon wheel. "Orc lover, you make me sick." Grasha's hand moved toward her bow, but Henrik caught her wrist, held it gently. "Not worth it," he murmured. She subsided, but her jaw was tight with fury. Ferris watched this exchange with something like amusement. Then he leaned back in his saddle and said, "Well then, I suppose this is goodbye. I would say I hope you survive out there, but I would be lying. The wilderness does not suffer fools lightly, and you are the biggest fool I have ever met." He wheeled his horse around and signaled to the other riders. They followed him back toward the town, leaving Henrik and Grasha alone on the road. Henrik waited until they were out of sight before releasing the breath he had been holding. "That was a threat," Grasha said quietly. "He will send men after us, maybe, but we will be long gone by then." They drove north, away from the borderlands they both knew, away from the places where humans and orcs had carved out their separate territories through centuries of bloodshed. Henrik had heard stories of the northern wilderness, a vast expanse of forest and mountain where few people ventured, where the land was wild and unforgiving but also unclaimed. If they could find a place there, a hidden valley or a sheltered hollow, they could build a new life. It would be hard. It would be dangerous, but it would be theirs. The first week was the hardest. They traveled from dawn until dusk, stopping only to rest the horses and eat cold meals from their supplies. The roads grew rougher and less maintained the further north they went, until finally they were following nothing but game trails through dense forest. Grasha navigated by instinct and by reading signs in the landscape that Henrik was only beginning to understand. She showed him how to tell direction by the moss on trees, how to find water by listening for certain bird calls, how to identify which plants were safe to eat and which would kill you. Henrik, for his part, taught her the practical skills of farming and building. He explained how to judge good soil, how to plan a field for maximum yield, how to preserve food for winter. They were learning each other's worlds, and in that learning, they were becoming something new together. Not quite human, not quite orc, but something that belonged to both worlds and neither. On the 10th day, they found it. A valley tucked between two steep ridges, accessible only through a narrow gap in the rock that would have been easy to miss if Grasha's sharp eyes had not spotted the way the trees grew differently there. They guided the wagon through the gap and emerged into a place that took Henrik's breath away. The valley was perhaps 2 miles long and half a mile wide, carpeted in spring grass and wildflowers. A stream ran down the center, clear and cold from mountain snowmelt. The ridges on either side were steep enough to provide shelter from wind, but not so steep that they felt enclosed. The southern end of the valley opened onto a gentle slope where the forest thinned, and Henrik could already envision fields there, rows of wheat and barley and vegetables. The northern end was all old-growth forest, massive trees that would provide timber and game and firewood for generations. "This is it," Grasha said, and Henrik heard the wonder in her voice. "This is our place." They made camp that night beside the stream, and for the first time since leaving the farm, Henrik felt something like peace. They cooked a real meal over an open fire, rabbit that Grasha had shot that afternoon, seasoned with wild herbs she had foraged. They ate under the stars, and afterward they lay on their blankets and looked up at the vast sweep of the sky. And Grasha told Henrik the orc names for the constellations, stories of ancient heroes and tragic lovers that were completely different from the human stories Henrik had grown up with. "In my clan," Grasha said quietly, "there is a story about the first orc who fell in love with a human. It is a tragedy. They both died, killed by their own people for daring to love across the divide. When I was a child, I thought it was a stupid story. I thought, why would anyone be so foolish? Why not just choose someone from your own kind and be safe? What do you think now?" She turned her head to look at him, and in the firelight her face was beautiful in a way that made his throat tight. "Now I understand. Some things are worth dying for, some loves are worth any cost." "I do not plan on dying," Henrik said, reaching over to take her hand. "I plan on living a very long, very boring life with you in this valley. We are going to grow old and argue about whose turn it is to milk the goats and complain about our aching backs. That is my plan." She laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "A boring life. I think I would like that." They spent the next 3 months building. Henrik designed a cabin, small but solid, using the timber from the forest and the stone from the stream. Grasha proved to be a quick learner and a tireless worker, and together they felled trees, shaped logs, mixed mortar and laid stone until their hands were covered in blisters and their muscles screamed. But slowly, impossibly, the cabin took shape. It was not fancy. One room that would serve as kitchen, sleeping quarters, and living space, with a loft above for storage and a stone fireplace that Henrik built with painstaking care. The windows were small, just large enough to let in light but not so large that they could not be shuttered securely in winter. The door was solid oak, hung on iron hinges Henrik had forged himself using his father's tools and a makeshift furnace. While Henrik worked on the cabin, Grasha hunted and foraged, keeping them fed with fresh meat and wild plants. She was an extraordinary hunter, moving through the forest with a silence and grace that Henrik could only marvel at. She brought down deer, wild boar, rabbits, and once, memorably, a massive elk that provided them with enough meat to smoke and preserve for weeks. She also taught Henrik to hunt in the orc way, with patience and respect for the prey, thanking each animal for its sacrifice and using every part of the kill. In the evenings, after the work was done and they had eaten, they would sit by the fire and talk. Henrik told Grasha about his childhood, about his mother's gentleness and his father's stern but loving nature, about the farm and the rhythms of the seasons. Grasha told him about growing up in Clan Ironhide, about the harsh discipline of orc warrior training, about the day she realized she did not want to spend her life raiding and fighting. She had left her clan 2 years ago, she said, and had been wandering ever since, caught between two worlds belonging to neither. "I thought I would always be alone," she admitted one night, her head resting on Henrik's shoulder. "I thought that was the price of choosing my own path. And then I met you." "I thought the same thing," Henrik said. "After my father died, the loneliness was worse than the grief. I would wake up every morning and remember all over again that I was the last one, that there was no family left. And then you showed up, bleeding and stubborn, and suddenly I had a reason to get up in the morning." She lifted her head to look at him. "Henrik, I need to tell you something. About that night I came to your farm. It was not an accident. I knew your farm was there. I had been watching it for weeks." Henrik's heart skipped. "Watching it?" "I was trying to work up the courage to approach you, to ask for work or shelter or just to see if a human would look at me and see something other than a monster. But I was afraid. And then one night I was in the forest and I heard riders. Human bandits hunting for sport. They saw me and gave chase. One of them shot me. I ran and your farm was the only place I could think to go, so I came, and you helped me, and I have been thanking the gods every day since." Henrik processed this slowly. "So you chose me, even before I chose you?" "Yes." He kissed her then, long and deep, and when they broke apart he said, "Then I suppose we chose each other. That seems like fate to me. Orcs do not believe in fate, we believe in will, in the strength to forge your own path. Then I will believe in your will, and in mine, and in what we are building together." The cabin was finished by midsummer, and they spent a week making it a home. Grasha sewed curtains from spare fabric and gathered wildflowers to place in a clay pot on the table Henrik had built. Henrik carved their initials into the door frame, H and G, twined together like the roots of two trees grown as one. They brought in their few possessions, hung Grasha's bow on the wall beside Henrik's father's hunting knife, and stood in the center of the room, looking at what they had made. "It is perfect," Grasha said softly. "It is ours," Henrik agreed. That night, they consummated their commitment to each other in the bed they had built together, and Henrik learned the geography of Grasha's body, the places that made her gasp and shiver, the scars that told stories of battles and hardship. She was strong and fierce and tender all at once, and afterward, lying tangled together in the darkness, Henrik thought that he had never been happier. But happiness, he was learning, was something you had to fight for every day. The first real threat came in early autumn. Henrik was working in the field they had cleared and planted at the southern end of the valley, checking the wheat that was beginning to ripen, when Grasha appeared at the tree line, moving fast. Her bow was in her hand, an arrow already knocked. "Inside," she said quietly. "Now." Henrik did not argue. He followed her back to the cabin at a run, and once inside she barred the door and moved to the window, peering out through the gap in the shutters. "What is it?" Henrik asked, reaching for his own bow. "Orc hunters. 3 of them. Ironhide clan from the markings. They are tracking something, probably me. If they find me here with you, they will kill us both." Henrik's blood went cold. "Can we hide?" "Not from orc trackers. They will smell the smoke from our fire, see the disturbed earth of our fields. They will know someone lives here." She was silent for a moment, thinking. Then she said, "I will lead them away. You stay here. If I do not come back, head south. Find another place." "Absolutely not. We face this together." "Henrik, together, Grasha. That is what we agreed." She looked at him, and he saw the fear in her eyes, but also the love. Finally, she nodded. "Together. But we do this smart. We make them think we are just a human homesteader and his orc servant. Humans are allowed to have orc servants, yes. In some places. Then that is our story. I am your servant. You own me. If they believe that, they might leave us alone." It was a thin hope, but it was something. They waited, and 20 minutes later there was a heavy knock on the door. Grasha moved to stand behind Henrik, her head bowed in a posture of subservience that looked completely wrong on her. Henrik took a deep breath and opened the door. 3 orc warriors stood outside. They were bigger than Grasha, heavily muscled, with elaborate tribal markings painted on their skin and weapons that spoke of lives spent fighting. The one in front, a massive male with a scar across his face and tusks as long as Henrik's fingers, looked Henrik up and down with cold assessment. "Human," the warrior said in heavily accented human tongue. "You live here." "I do. This is my land." The warrior's gaze shifted to Grasha. His eyes narrowed. You look familiar. What is your name?" Grasha kept her head bowed. "I am called Grasha. I serve this human." "Grasha." The warrior stepped closer, and Henrik's hand tightened on the door frame, fighting the urge to step between them. "Grasha of Ironhide clan. Grasha who abandoned her people and brought shame to her family." "I left with honor," Grasha said quietly. "I challenged the chief and lost. I accepted exile." "Exile means you are dead to us, but here you are alive, serving a human." The warrior spat on the ground. "You are lower than I thought." Henrik could see Grasha trembling with rage, but she held her tongue. The warrior circled her slowly, then looked back at Henrik. "You own her." "She works for me," Henrik said carefully. "In exchange for food and shelter. And you do not fear her. She could cut your throat in the night. She has had plenty of chances. I trust her." The warrior considered this. Then he said, "You have claimed this valley as your land." "I have." "There is no crown authority here, no law. If I were to kill you and take your woman, no one would know or care." Henrik's heart hammered, but he kept his voice steady. "True. But then you would have to explain to whoever comes looking for me why 3 Ironhide warriors were so far into human territory. The peace between our peoples is fragile. I do not think your chief would be pleased if you were the one to break it." It was a bluff and a weak one, but the warrior seemed to consider it. Finally, he stepped back. "You have courage, human, or stupidity. I have not decided which, but I will leave you to your land and your orc servant. A word of advice, though, watch your back. She is Ironhide. We do not forget and we do not forgive." The 3 warriors left, melting back into the forest as silently as they had come. Henrik closed the door and leaned against it, his legs suddenly weak. Grasha stood in the center of the room, her fists clenched, her whole body shaking. "I am sorry," she said roughly. "I am so sorry. I should have told you my clan might come looking for me. I should have." Henrik crossed the room and pulled her into his arms. "You have nothing to apologize for. We handled it. We are safe. For now. but they know where we are. They know I am here with you. Word will spread. Then let it spread. We are not hiding, Grasha. We are living our lives. If your clan or my people or anyone else has a problem with that, they can face both of us. She held him tightly, and he felt her fear slowly give way to something else. Determination. Resolve. I love you, Henrik Finch, she said. I love you so much it terrifies me. I love you too, and I am terrified every single day, but I would rather be terrified with you than safe and alone. The encounter with the Ironhide warriors changed something between them. Before, they had been building a life, yes, but some part of both of them had been waiting for the other shoe to drop, for reality to catch up with them. Now reality had arrived, had looked them in the eye, and they had faced it down together. They were stronger for it. As autumn deepened, they worked to prepare for winter. Henrik showed Grasha how to preserve vegetables, how to bank the fire for slow cooking, how to insulate the cabin against the cold. Grasha showed Henrik how to track and trap smaller game, how to read snow for signs of predators, how to move silently through winter forest. They filled their root cellar with potatoes, turnips, carrots, and squash. They smoked and salted meat. They chopped wood until they had a pile that reached the cabin roof. They were ready. The first snow came in late October, a light dusting that melted by midday. But within a week, the real snow arrived, heavy flakes that fell for 3 days straight and blanketed the valley in white. Henrik and Grasha woke on the 4th day to a transformed world, silent and pristine and impossibly beautiful. They spent that winter in a kind of hibernation, venturing out only when necessary, spending most of their time in the cabin, keeping the fire high and the cold at bay. It was during those long winter days and nights that they truly became one. They talked about everything and nothing. They made love slowly and tenderly, learning each other with the patience of people who knew they had all the time in the world. They read aloud from Henrik's father's books, classic tales of adventure and romance that took on new meaning when read in a cabin in the wilderness with the woman he loved. One night in deep winter, when the wind howled outside and the fire crackled warm inside, Grasha said, "We should make it official." Henrik looked up from the shirt he was mending. "What do you mean, the marriage? We said we would marry, but we never actually did it. I want to marry you, Henrik." "Properly? There is no magistrate here, no priest. We do not need them. In orc tradition, a marriage is a promise made before the gods and the land. We speak our vows, we bind our hands, we share blood. That is all." Henrik set aside his mending. "Tell me what to do." They prepared the ceremony that night. Grasha had Henrik fetch a bowl of snow from outside, which she melted over the fire and poured into a clay cup. She took out her hunting knife and cleaned it carefully, then held it out to Henrik. "We each speak our vows," she said. "Then we cut our palms and bind them together, mixing our blood. Then we drink from the same cup. That binds us in the eyes of the gods and the land. Are you ready?" "I am." They stood facing each other in the firelight, and Grasha spoke first, her voice strong and clear. "I, Grasha of no clan, daughter of warriors, wanderer and hunter, take you, Henrik Finch, as my husband. I vow to stand beside you in all things. I vow to protect you, to provide for you, to honor you. I vow to be your partner in building our life, our home, our future. I vow to love you until my last breath and beyond if the gods allow it. This is my oath, sworn in blood and fire." Henrik's throat was tight, but he forced the words out, and once he started, they came more easily. "I, Henrik Finch, farmer and builder, last of my line, take you, Grasha, as my wife. I vow to stand beside you in all things. I vow to protect you, to provide for you, to honor you. I vow to be your partner in building our life, our home, our future. I vow to love you until my last breath and beyond if the gods allow it. This is my oath, sworn in blood and fire." Grasha took the knife and cut her palm, a quick, clean slice that welled with blood. She handed the knife to Henrik, and he did the same, wincing at the sharp pain. They pressed their palms together, and Henrik felt their blood mingle, warm and wet and binding. Grasha took the cup in her free hand and raised it. "By blood and water, by fire and earth, by the gods above and below, we are bound. Two become one. One becomes eternal." She drank from the cup, then handed it to Henrik. He drank, tasting the clean mineral tang of snowmelt, and when he lowered the cup, Grasha kissed him, her lips warm and her hand still pressed to his. "Now we are truly married," she said when they broke apart. "Now nothing can separate us." They bound their hands with clean linen to let the cuts heal, and that night they lay together as husband and wife, and Henrik felt a completeness he had never known was possible. Grasha was his. He was hers. They were each other's, bound by choice and blood and love. Winter passed slowly but not unpleasantly. They had plenty of food, plenty of firewood, and plenty of each other. When spring finally arrived, melting the snow and coaxing green shoots from the earth, they emerged from the cabin to find their valley transformed once again, bursting with life and possibility. They planted the fields together that spring, working side by side from dawn until dusk, sowing the seeds they had saved and carefully tended through the winter. They repaired the cabin where winter weather had caused damage, strengthened the fences around their small vegetable garden, and built a proper chicken coop so they could start raising birds for eggs and meat. By midsummer, the valley was thriving. The wheat in the fields grew tall and golden. The garden produced more vegetables than they could eat. The chickens Grasha had managed to trade for with a passing trapper laid eggs every morning. They had built something real here, something lasting. One morning in late summer, Henrik woke to find Grasha standing at the window, looking out at the valley with an expression he could not quite read. "What is it?" he asked, rising and moving to stand beside her. "I am happy," she said simply. "I am so happy it frightens me. I keep waiting for something to go wrong. Nothing is going to go wrong. You cannot know that. No, but I can choose to believe it." He put his arm around her shoulders. "We have built a good life here, Grasha. We have faced everything the world has thrown at us, and we are still standing. Still together. That means something." She leaned into him. "It means everything." But the world, as it turned out, was not finished with them yet. The trouble came in the form of a stranger, a young man who stumbled into their valley one afternoon in early autumn. Henrik was working in the field when he saw the figure emerge from the forest, moving erratically, and his first instinct was to reach for the weapon he kept nearby. But as the stranger drew closer, Henrik realized he was injured and young, barely more than a boy. Henrik ran to help, catching the young man as he collapsed. Up close, Henrik could see he was human, dressed in the remnants of what looked like soldier's garb and covered in blood from multiple wounds. His eyes were glazed with pain and fever. "Please," the young man gasped. "Bandits. They killed everyone. Need help." Grasha appeared at Henrik's side, her face grim. "Bring him inside, quickly." They carried the young man to the cabin and laid him on their bed. Grasha began cutting away his clothes to assess the wounds while Henrik fetched water and bandages. The injuries were bad. Deep cuts across his ribs and a nasty gash on his thigh, but none immediately fatal if they could stop the bleeding and prevent infection. They worked together, cleaning and stitching and binding, and slowly the young man's breathing steadied. He fell into an exhausted sleep, and Henrik and Grasha stepped outside to confer. He said, "Bandits," Henrik said. "If there are bandits in the area, we need to be prepared." He was wearing a soldier's uniform, Crown Army from the look of it. What was a Crown soldier doing this far north? "I do not know, but we should ask him when he wakes up. The young man slept for 2 days, waking only briefly to take water and broth before falling back into fevered unconsciousness. On the 3rd day, he finally opened his eyes and seemed to truly see them for the first time. "Where am I?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Our home," Henrik said. "You stumbled into our valley 3 days ago. You were badly injured." The young man tried to sit up, winced, and fell back against the pillows. "My unit. We were attacked. Are there others? Did anyone else make it?" "You were alone when we found you." The young man closed his eyes, pain etched on his face. "They are all dead, then?" "Who is dead?" Grasha asked gently. "What happened?" Over the next hour, the story came out in pieces. The young man's name was Tobias, and he was part of a crown scouting party sent to investigate reports of increased bandit activity in the northern wilderness. They had been ambushed a week ago, overwhelmed by numbers and superior strategy. Tobias had been the only one to escape, and he had been wandering injured and delirious ever since. "How many bandits?" Henrik asked. "At least 20. Maybe more. They are organized, well armed. They have a camp somewhere in these mountains." Tobias looked at Henrik, really looked at him, and his eyes widened slightly. "You are human." "I am. And she," he looked at Grasha, and Henrik saw the moment recognition set in. "She is an orc. She is my wife." Tobias processed this slowly. Then, to Henrik's surprise, he laughed weakly. "Well, I suppose if you are willing to marry an orc, you are probably not working with human bandits. That is something." "Rest," Grasha said firmly. "We can discuss the bandits when you are stronger." Tobias stayed with them for 2 weeks while his wounds healed. He proved to be good company, quick-witted and surprisingly open-minded for a crown soldier. He asked Henrik and Grasha about their life, about how they had ended up here, and he listened to their story with what seemed like genuine interest rather than judgment. "You gave up everything," he said one evening as they sat around the fire. "Your home, your citizenship, for love." "For her," Henrik said, reaching over to take Grasha's hand. "Yes," Tobias shook his head in wonder. "I grew up believing orcs were monsters, mindless savages who only knew violence. But Grasha saved my life. You both did. I do not know what to think anymore." "Think that people are people," Grasha said. "Orc, human, it does not matter. We all bleed the same, we all love the same. The hatred between our peoples is taught, not born." "Maybe," Tobias said thoughtfully. "Maybe you are right." When Tobias was well enough to travel, Henrik and Grasha supplied him with food and directions back to the nearest crown outpost. Before he left, Tobias clasped Henrik's hand and then, to everyone's surprise, Grasha's as well. "Thank you," he said, "for saving me. For showing me that the world is bigger and more complex than I thought. I will not forget this." "Will you tell them about us?" Henrik asked. "The crown," Tobias considered this. "I will tell them I was saved by a kind homesteader and his servant. They do not need to know more than that. You have built something good here. I would not be the one to destroy it." After Tobias left, life returned to the comfortable rhythms Henrik and Grasha had established. They harvested the wheat and vegetables, stored food for winter, and settled in for another season of cold and isolation. But this winter felt different from the last. They were more confident, more secure in what they had built. The cabin felt less like a shelter and more like a true home. It was in the depths of that second winter, on a night when the wind howled like a living thing outside, that Grasha told Henrik she was pregnant. Henrik had been carving a new handle for an axe that had cracked, working by firelight while Grasha sewed beside him. She set down her sewing and said very quietly, "I need to tell you something." Something in her tone made Henrik look up immediately. "What is it? Are you ill?" "No, not ill." She took a deep breath. "I am with child, Henrik. I am going to have a baby." Henrik's hands went still. He stared at her, trying to process the words. "A baby." Their baby, half human, half orc, a child born of two worlds belonging fully to neither. "Are you certain?" he finally managed. "I am certain. I have known for a few weeks now, but I wanted to be sure before I told you." Henrik set down the axe handle and crossed to kneel in front of her, taking her hands in his. "How do you feel about this?" "Terrified," she admitted. "I do not know how to be a mother. I do not know if a child like ours can even survive. Half-breeds are rare, Henrik. I have heard stories, but I do not know if they are true." "We will figure it out," Henrik said firmly. "Together. We have faced everything else together. We will face this too." Tears welled in Grasha's eyes, and Henrik realized it was the first time he had ever seen her cry. "What if I am a terrible mother? What if I do not know how to be gentle enough or patient enough? You will be a wonderful mother. You are the strongest, bravest, most caring person I know. Our child will be lucky to have you." She pulled him close, burying her face in his shoulder, and he held her while she cried, offering the comfort and strength she had so often given him. The pregnancy changed everything. Henrik became obsessively protective, insisting Grasha rest more, eat more, work less. Grasha, for her part, tried to continue as normal, but Henrik could see that she was tired in a way she had never been before, her body working to create new life. As spring approached, they began preparing for the baby in earnest. Henrik built a cradle from smooth pine, sanding it until there were no rough edges, carving protective symbols into the wood that Grasha taught him from orc tradition. Grasha sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her large hands surprisingly delicate as she worked. They argued good-naturedly about names, about how they would teach the child, about what kind of life they could give a half-orc child in a world that might reject them. "Our child will belong nowhere," Grasha said one night, her hand resting on her swelling belly. "Not human enough for humans, not orc enough for orcs. Our child will belong here," Henrik said firmly. "With us, in this valley, and that will be enough." The baby came in late spring, on a day when the valley was green and bursting with new life. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Henrik thought he might lose them both, Grasha and the child. But Grasha was strong, stronger than anyone he had ever known. And when the sun rose on the second day of labor, their daughter entered the world with a cry that echoed off the valley walls. Henrik took the baby in trembling hands, and his first thought was that she was perfect. She had Grasha's green skin, but a lighter shade, like new leaves. She had tusks, tiny ones barely visible, and pointed ears like her mother. But her eyes, when they opened, were Henrik's eyes, bright blue and curious. Her fingers were long and delicate, her face a beautiful blend of both her parents. "A girl," Henrik said, his voice breaking. "We have a daughter." Grasha reached up weakly, and Henrik placed the baby in her arms. Grasha looked down at their daughter with an expression of such pure love that Henrik felt his heart might burst. "What should we name her?" Grasha asked. They had discussed names for months, but in that moment, looking at his daughter, Henrik knew there was only one right choice. "Hope," he said. "Her name is Hope." Grasha smiled, tears streaming down her face. "Hope, yes, because she is our hope, our future." Raising Hope was simultaneously the hardest and most rewarding thing Henrik had ever done. She was a colicky baby, crying often and sleeping little, and there were nights when Henrik and Grasha took turns walking her around the cabin, trying every trick they could think of to soothe her. But she was also a miracle, a living symbol of their love, and every smile, every small milestone, filled Henrik with a joy he had not known was possible. As Hope grew, it became clear that she had inherited traits from both parents. She had her mother's strength and her father's curiosity. She learned to walk early, toddling around the cabin with determination. and she learned to talk in a mix of human and orc words that sounded like a language all her own. By the time Hope was 2 years old, she was helping in the garden, her small hands digging in the soil with enthusiasm if not precision. She followed Grasha into the forest, learning to identify plants and animal tracks. She sat on Henrik's lap while he read, demanding the same stories over and over with the endless patience of childhood. One afternoon in summer, when Hope was 3, she asked the question Henrik had been dreading. "Why do I look different?" She was examining her reflection in the water bucket, touching her small tusks with curious fingers. Henrik and Grasha exchanged glances. They had known this conversation would come eventually, but that did not make it easier. "You look different because you are special," Grasha said gently, crouching down to Hope's level. "Your papa is human and I am orc. You are both. You are the best of both worlds." "But why?" Hope persisted. "Why do not other children look like me?" "Because there are not many children like you," Henrik said. "Most humans marry humans and most orcs marry orcs. But your mother and I fell in love, and we married even though people said we should not. And then we had you, and you are the most precious thing in the world to us." Hope considered this seriously. "Are there other children like me, maybe," Grasha said, "somewhere, but we have not met them." "Oh." Hope returned her attention to her reflection. "I think I look nice." "You look beautiful," Henrik said, pulling her into a hug, "just like your mother." The years passed, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. When Hope was 5, Henrik began teaching her to read, using the same books his mother had taught him with. When she was 6, Grasha began teaching her to hunt, starting with small game and working up. Hope absorbed everything like a sponge, her mind quick and her hands skilled. The valley remained isolated, their sanctuary from a world that might not understand them. Occasionally travelers would pass through, traders or trappers, and Henrik and Grasha would trade furs or crops for supplies they could not make themselves. But they were careful. Hope was always kept out of sight during these encounters, hidden safely in the cabin or the forest. The world was not ready for her, not yet. When Hope was 7, something happened that forced them to reevaluate their isolation. It was a summer evening, and Henrik was teaching Hope to identify constellations while Grasha prepared dinner inside. They heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching, multiple horses moving fast. Henrik's blood went cold. They rarely had visitors and never so many at once. "Inside," he told Hope quietly. "Go to your mother. Do not come out until we say." Hope's eyes went wide, but she obeyed, running to the cabin. Henrik waited, his hand on the hunting knife at his belt as the riders emerged from the tree line. There were 5 of them, all human, all armed. Henrik recognized the lead rider immediately and felt his stomach drop. Deputy Ferris, older and harder than he had been 8 years ago, but unmistakably the same man who had threatened Henrik on the road from town. Well, Ferris said, dismounting. "Henrik Finch, I heard rumors you were still alive out here, but I had to see for myself." "What do you want, Ferris?" "Just checking on you, making sure you are not causing any trouble." His gaze traveled past Henrik to the cabin, to the fields, to the obvious signs of long-term habitation. "You have done well for yourself, built a nice little homestead. I am impressed." "Thank you." "Now leave." "Not until I see what else you have been building out here." Ferris started toward the cabin and Henrik moved to block his path. "You are not welcome here. This is my land." "Your land," Ferris laughed. "You are not a citizen, Finch. You have no rights. You have nothing." He pushed past Henrik and Henrik grabbed his arm. That was a mistake. Ferris spun, his fist connecting with Henrik's jaw, and Henrik went down hard. He heard Grasha's roar of fury from inside the cabin, heard the door slam open, and then Grasha was there, her bow drawn. An arrow pointed at Ferris's chest. "Touch him again and you die," she said, her voice deadly calm. The other riders went for their weapons, but Ferris held up a hand. "Easy now. No need for violence." He looked at Grasha with something like admiration. "Still with him after all these years. That is loyalty, I suppose." "What do you want?" Grasha demanded. "Just to remind your husband that he exists on the crown's sufferance. We could take everything from him at any time. This land, this farm, his life." Ferris's gaze shifted to the cabin, and Henrik saw the moment he registered the small face peering out from the window. Hope, who had not been able to resist looking, Ferris's eyes widened. "Is that leave?" Henrik said, getting to his feet. "Now." But Ferris was staring at Hope, at her green skin and tusks, at the visible proof that Henrik and Grasha had not just lived together but created life together. "You have a child, a half-breed child." "She is my daughter," Henrik said, moving to stand between Ferris and the cabin. "And you will not speak about her that way. The crown does not recognize half-breeds. They are abominations, proof of your crime. The crown does not reach here. You said so yourself. We are beyond law, beyond citizenship. That means you have no authority over us." Ferris's hand moved to his sword, and for a terrible moment Henrik thought he would draw it. But then one of the other riders, a man Henrik did not recognize, said quietly, "Deputy. The magistrate sent us to observe, not to engage. We should report back." Ferris's jaw clenched, but he nodded slowly. "You are right." He looked at Henrik one last time. "I will be reporting this. What the crown decides to do with the information is up to them. But if I were you, I would watch my back, Finch. The world is changing. The tolerance for your kind of perversion is ending." The riders left, and Henrik stood frozen until they were out of sight. Then his legs gave out and he sat down hard on the ground. Grasha was beside him immediately, pulling him close. "They know about Hope," she said quietly. "They will tell others. I know, we might have to leave, find somewhere more remote. Maybe." Henrik looked back at the cabin, at Hope's frightened face in the window. "But I am tired of running, Grasha. I am tired of hiding. This is our home, our land, our life. I do not want to run any more." "Then what do? We stand our ground. We protect our family, and we trust that we are stronger together than anything the world can throw at us." It was easier said than done. Over the following weeks, Henrik and Grasha waited for the other shoe to drop, for crown soldiers or bounty hunters or something worse to arrive. But nothing happened. The valley remained quiet, and slowly they began to relax, to believe that maybe Ferris's threat had been empty. They kept teaching Hope, kept living their lives, but with a new awareness of how fragile their peace was. Henrik began teaching Hope to defend herself, starting with basic knife work and moving to archery. Grasha taught her the orc arts of stealth and tracking. If trouble came, their daughter would be ready. And then, on a cold morning in late autumn when Hope was 8 years old, trouble arrived in a form none of them had expected. Henrik was chopping wood behind the cabin when he heard voices from the tree line. He grabbed his axe and moved toward the sound, ready for a fight, and stopped dead when he saw who stood there, Tobias. The young soldier they had saved 9 years ago. But he was not alone. With him were 3 other people, 2 humans and an orc, and they all looked tired and desperate. "Henrik," Tobias said, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I am sorry to come unannounced. We need help." Henrik's mind raced. Letting Tobias leave had been a calculated risk, one that had apparently paid off since no crown soldiers had appeared. But now Tobias was back and he had brought others. "What kind of help?" Henrik asked cautiously. "Sanctuary. These people," Tobias gestured to the others, "they are like you. Human and orc couples cast out or fleeing persecution. I have been helping them find safe places, and I remembered your valley. I thought maybe you could shelter them, at least temporarily." Henrik looked at the three refugees. One was a human woman and an orc male, both middle-aged and exhausted. The other was a younger human man with a haunted look in his eyes. They looked at Henrik with desperate hope. Grasha appeared at Henrik's side, hope peeking out from behind her. Tobias's eyes widened when he saw Hope. "You have a child," he said wonderingly. "A daughter." "Her name is Hope," Grasha said. "And yes, we will help your refugees. Bring them inside. We will feed them and hear their stories." Over the next few hours, the stories emerged. The human woman, whose name was Margaret, had fallen in love with an orc warrior named Throck during a prisoner exchange. They had fled together when their relationship was discovered. The younger man, called Simon, had been in love with an orc woman named Kesh, but she had been killed by her own clan for the shame of loving a human. Simon had been wandering ever since, broken and lost. "The world is getting worse," Tobias explained. "The new king has issued edicts against interspecies relationships. There are bounties on mixed couples now. I have been doing what I can to help people escape, but it is getting harder." "Why are you helping them?" Henrik asked. "You are a crown soldier. This is treason. Because you showed me a better way. You and Grasha. You saved my life and opened my eyes. I cannot go back to blindly following orders when I know those orders are wrong." That night they made plans. The valley was not big enough to support multiple families long-term, but it could serve as a way station, a place where refugees could rest and resupply before moving on. Henrik and Grasha would provide what help they could: food, shelter, information about safe routes north. Margaret and Throck stayed for a week before heading further into the mountains, where Tobias said there was a community of exiles building a new settlement. Simon stayed longer, helping with the farm work, slowly healing from his grief. By the time he left, a month later, he looked less haunted, more like a man who might find a way to keep living. Over the next 2 years, Tobias brought more refugees through the valley. Some stayed days, others weeks. Henrik and Grasha helped them all, and in the process, they found themselves part of something larger than just their own love story. They were part of a movement, a quiet rebellion against hatred and fear. Hope grew up surrounded by this parade of refugees, and she learned from each of them. She learned that love came in many forms, that family was not defined by blood, but by choice, that courage sometimes meant simply refusing to stop loving someone the world said you should hate. By the time Hope was 10, she was a skilled hunter, a competent farmer, and a fierce defender of everyone who sought refuge in their valley. She had her mother's strength and her father's compassion, and Henrik and Grasha were endlessly proud of the person she was becoming. One spring morning, Tobias arrived with news that changed everything. "The king is dying," he said without preamble. "His son, the prince, is set to inherit, and the prince is not like his father. He has spoken against the persecution of mixed couples. He believes the edicts are wrong." Henrik hardly dared to hope. "What does that mean?" "It means things might change. When the prince becomes king, he plans to repeal the laws against interspecies marriage. He plans to grant amnesty to those who were exiled." "We could go home," Grasha said quietly. "We could have citizenship again." "Maybe," Tobias said, "if the prince survives long enough to take the throne. There are factions in the court who would rather see him dead than see those laws repealed." The waiting was agony. For 6 months, they heard nothing, and Henrik tried not to let himself hope. They had built a good life in the valley. They did not need the approval of the crown to be happy. But some small part of him longed for recognition, for the world to acknowledge that what he and Grasha had was not a crime but a testament to love's power. Finally, in late autumn, Tobias arrived with an official-looking scroll bearing the royal seal. "The prince is king," Tobias said, grinning. "Long live King Edmund, and he has kept his promise." Henrik unrolled the scroll with trembling hands and read. It was a proclamation, signed and sealed by the new king, officially repealing all laws against interspecies marriage and relationships. More than that, it granted full pardons and restoration of citizenship to anyone who had been exiled under the old laws. "We can go home," Henrik said, barely able to process it, but Grasha was shaking her head, smiling. "Henrik, we are home. This valley, this life we built, this is our home. We do not need to go back." Henrik looked at her, at Hope standing beside her, at the cabin they had built with their own hands, at the fields they had planted and tended, at the valley that had sheltered them through everything. She was right. This was home. "But the recognition," he said. "The acknowledgement that what we have is valid. We have always known it was valid. We did not need the king's permission to love each other." Grasha took his hand. "But I am glad the world is changing. I am glad that other couples will not have to suffer what we suffered." Tobias cleared his throat. "There is one more thing. The king wants to meet you, both of you. He has heard about your valley, about the refugees you have sheltered. He wants to offer you official positions as liaisons between human and orc communities. He wants to build bridges, and he thinks you can help." Henrik and Grasha looked at each other. It was tempting to be part of building a better world, to ensure that other couples could love freely without fear. That was meaningful work. "We would have to travel," Henrik said slowly. "Leave the valley sometimes. Hope could come with us," Grasha pointed out. "She should see more of the world, learn that not everyone hates her for what she is." "I want to go," Hope said firmly. "I want to meet the king, I want to help." So they went. They left the valley for the first time in over a decade, traveling south with Tobias as their guide. The journey took 2 weeks, and every mile closer to the capital, Henrik felt his anxiety grow. But Grasha's hand in his was steady, and Hope's excitement was infectious, and by the time they arrived, Henrik felt ready to face whatever awaited them. King Edmund was younger than Henrik expected, barely 30, with kind eyes and a determined set to his jaw. He received them in a private audience chamber, not the formal throne room, and he stood to greet them rather than making them kneel. "Henrik and Henrik Finch," he said warmly, "and this must be Hope. I have heard so much about all of you. Thank you for coming." They talked for hours. The king asked about their valley, about the refugees they had sheltered, about Hope's upbringing. He shared his vision for a kingdom where humans and orcs could live peacefully, where interspecies families were not just tolerated but celebrated. He asked if Henrik and Grasha would help him build that future. "We would be honored," Henrik said finally, "but our valley is our home. We cannot leave it permanently. I would not ask you to. But perhaps a few months a year, traveling to orc clans and human settlements, sharing your story, showing people that peace is possible. Would that be acceptable?" It was more than acceptable. It was perfect. They agreed, and over the next several years they became something unexpected: ambassadors, advocates, living proof that love could transcend hatred. They traveled extensively, Hope always with them, and everywhere they went, people were curious, skeptical, and eventually, slowly, convinced. Seeing Henrik and Grasha together, seeing the obvious love and respect between them, seeing Hope's intelligence and grace, people began to question their prejudices. It was not easy. There were places where they were met with hostility, where people spat at them or called them abominations. But there were also places where they were welcomed, where people listened, where minds began to change, and always they returned to the valley, to their home, the place where their love had taken root and grown into something beautiful and unshakable. When Hope was 16, she asked them the question Henrik had been both dreading and anticipating. "I want to see more of the world," she said. "Not just with you, on my own. I want to find other people like me, other half-breeds, and learn their stories." Henrik's first instinct was to say no to protect her, to keep her safe in the valley where nothing could hurt her. But Grasha met his eyes, and he saw his own thoughts reflected there. They had raised Hope to be strong, independent, brave. They could not keep her sheltered forever. "If that is what you want," Henrik said carefully, "then you have our blessing, but be careful. The world is safer than it was, but it is not entirely safe." "I will be careful," Hope promised. "You taught me well." She left in the spring, with supplies and their love and a promise to write whenever she could. Henrik and Grasha stood at the edge of the valley watching her go, and Henrik felt his heart breaking and swelling with pride in equal measure. "We did well," Grasha said quietly. "She is strong. She will be fine. I know, but I will still worry every day until she comes back." "Me too." Letters came regularly over the next 2 years. Hope traveled to the northern settlement where Margaret and Throck had settled, and she found a community of mixed families thriving there. She traveled to orc clans who were slowly opening to the idea of peaceful coexistence. She even traveled to the capital, where she met with King Edmund and shared her perspective as someone who belonged to both worlds and neither. When she finally returned to the valley, she was 18, and she was not alone. With her was a young human man named Jasper, and from the way they looked at each other, Henrik knew immediately what this was. "Mother, father," Hope said, her voice nervous and excited. "This is Jasper. We want to get married." Henrik looked at Jasper, who met his gaze steadily despite obvious nerves. "Do you love my daughter?" "With all my heart, sir." "And Hope, do you love him?" "Yes, Papa, more than anything." Henrik looked at Grasha, who was smiling through tears. Then he pulled both young people into a hug. "Then you have our blessing. Welcome to the family, Jasper." They held the wedding in the valley, in the place where Henrik and Grasha had spoken their own vows all those years ago. Tobias came, older now and retired from the military, but still their dear friend. Margaret and Throck came, bringing their own children, 2 half-orc kids who had grown up strong and healthy. King Edmund sent a representative with his blessing and a generous gift. As Henrik watched Hope and Jasper speak their vows under the vast sky, with their hands bound and their promises spoken with tears and laughter, he felt the circle complete itself. They had started with nothing but love and determination. They had built a life, raised a daughter, helped change a kingdom. And now that daughter was beginning her own journey, building her own future. That night, after the celebration had ended and the guests had departed or gone to sleep, Henrik and Grasha sat by the fire in the cabin they had built together so many years ago. "You have any regrets?" Grasha asked quietly. Henrik thought about the question carefully. He thought about the farm he had lost, the life he had left behind, the years of struggle and danger. He thought about everything they had sacrificed and everything they had gained. "No," he said finally. "No regrets, not a single one. I signed that paper and took your hand, and it was the best decision I ever made. Every day with you has been a gift, Grasha, every single day." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I love you, Henrik Finch. I have loved you from the moment you pulled an arrow from my shoulder and did not ask for anything in return, and I will love you until my last breath and beyond. And I love you, always." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down to embers, and Henrik felt a peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. They had defied the world, built a life from nothing, and changed history in the process. But more than that, they had loved each other completely and without reservation, and that love had created ripples that spread far beyond their small valley. The world was changing. Slowly, imperfectly, but changing, and they had been part of that change. They had proved that love was stronger than hatred, that family was defined by choice, not blood, that courage was simply continuing to love in the face of fear. As the fire died and the stars emerged through the window, Henrik thought about the young man he had been, standing in the magistrate's office, reaching for the quill that would change his life forever. He thought about the fear and the certainty that had warred inside him, and how the certainty had won. They told him marrying an orc was a crime. He had signed the paper anyway and took her hand, and he would make that choice again, 1,000 times over in every lifetime and every world. Because some loves were worth any cost. Some bonds were stronger than law or custom or fear. And what he and Grasha had built together, in their hidden valley with their own hands and their unshakable faith in each other, was a testament to that truth. It was a legacy that would outlast them both. A story that would be told and retold, inspiring others to be brave enough to love freely, to choose happiness over safety, to build something beautiful in defiance of a world that said it could not exist. The fire had gone out completely now, and Henrik and Grasha rose together to go to bed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new moments to treasure. But tonight they had each other and the life they had built, and the knowledge that they had loved well and been loved in return. It was enough. It was everything. It was forever.